August 24, 1572. Paris. The night is not silent. It is suffocating, thick with the damp August heat and a smell that is uniquely Parisian. A foul mix of river mud, sewage, and baking bread, now sharpened by a new, metallic tang. It is the smell of fear. Inside the cavernous, stone-cold chambers of the Louvre Palace, the air itself seems to tremble, vibrating with a sound that has begun to ripple out from the bell tower of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. It is not the gentle call to prayer. It is the tocsin, a frantic, hammering clang of bronze on bronze, a sound that signals invasion, fire, or insurrection. It is the sound of a world ending. For the woman standing near a high, arched window, a stout figure cloaked in the perpetual black of mourning. This sound is the final, irrevocable note of a symphony she has spent a lifetime composing. This is Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother of France, and she is listening to the overture of a massacre. The sensory assault is total. From the streets below, the initial clamor of alarm gives way to something else. A terrifying, rising roar. A human hum that is no longer human. It is punctuated by splintering wood as doors are kicked in, the high-pitched shriek of steel on steel, and then screams. Not the cries of battle, but the pleading, agonized shrieks of the surprised, the unarmed, the dying. The crimson glow of torches begins to dance against the tapestries of her chambers, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhe like the damned. She can feel the penetrating chill of the ancient stones through the soles of her slippers, a cold that has nothing to do with the temperature. This is the moment the Black Queen of legend is born, the instant where policy becomes butchery. This was the night she, the mother of 3 kings, became the midwife to the murder of thousands of her subjects, all gathered in Paris under her personal guarantee of safety. To understand how this woman, this political genius, this survivor, could have possibly orchestrated, or at the very least permitted, such an abyss of violence, is to ask the central question of her life. How did the mother, whose entire existence was dedicated to the preservation of her children's legacy, come to believe that the only way to save it was to drown it in blood? This is the saga of him, or rather her, who was never meant to rule. This is the narrative of Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici, the shopkeeper's daughter from Florence, who found herself seated upon the throne of the most Christian kings of France. Her story is the ultimate paradox, a testament to the brutalizing alchemy of power. She was a mother, fiercely, primally so, giving birth to 10 children and fighting like a lioness to secure a throne for each of them. Yet this maternal devotion became the very engine of the catastrophe that would define her. She is remembered not as the mother of kings, but as Madame la Serpente, the poisoner, the astrologer, the architect of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the Black Queen who presided over the most vicious and self-destructive chapter in French history, the wars of religion. To understand this woman, we must return to the world that spawned her, a world where the very foundations of reality were cracking apart. She did not create the hatreds that tore France asunder, but she, more than any other, learned to navigate them, to manipulate them, and ultimately, to unleash them. Her life poses a terrifying question. What happens when the tools of a political realist, compromise, negotiation, dissimulation, and pragmatism, are applied to a problem of absolute fanatical faith? The answer was written in the blood-slicked streets of Paris. It is a story of how a woman's desperate, all-consuming love for her own dynasty, her own flesh and blood, led her to sanction the slaughter of her people, turning a political crisis into a moral abyss and leaving a legacy so contested, so dark, that even 500 years later, her name is still a synonym for ruthless, Machiavellian intrigue. This was not a story of a monster who craved blood, but a far more chilling narrative. The story of a protector who, in her desperation to guard her flock, became the wolf. To understand this woman, we must first understand the collapsing world she was thrust into, a geopolitical chessboard trembling on the brink of a new and terrifying age. The mid-16th century was not a time for the faint of heart. France, the kingdom Catherine would one day command, was a trapped beast, a nation caught in a vice of iron. To the south and to the east lay the immense, sprawling domains of the House of Habsburg, a dynastic superpower controlling Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. It was an empire upon which the sun never set, ruled by the cold and pious Philip II of Spain, a man who saw himself as the sword of Catholicism and France as a dangerously unreliable rival. This Habsburg encirclement was the permanent, suffocating reality of French foreign policy. Every diplomatic move, every marriage, every treaty was dictated by the need to breathe in the face of this colossal neighbor. And to the southeast, another shadow loomed, that of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, a seemingly unstoppable force that had conquered the Balkans, threatened Vienna, and whose corsairs dominated the Mediterranean, menacing the coasts of Italy and Spain. In this clash of titans, France was the fulcrum, a kingdom weakened by decades of costly Italian wars, its nobility dangerously powerful and independent, its treasury often teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. But the greatest threat was not external. It was a cancer growing from within. The seismic shock of Martin Luther's 95 Theses had, by Catherine's time, metastasized into the disciplined, revolutionary faith of John Calvin. The Protestant Reformation was not merely a theological dispute. It was a political earthquake that shattered the 1,000-year-old dream of a unified Christendom. It introduced a terrifying new idea that subjects might owe their allegiance not to their king, but to their God, and that a king who betrayed that God could be resisted, even overthrown. This ideology was the spark, and France, with its resentful nobility and disillusioned urban classes, was the powder keg. Catherine de Medici did not create this world on fire, but it was the only world she would ever know. It was a world of existential threats, where a single misstep could mean the dismemberment of her adopted kingdom. A place where the survival of the state was a daily, desperate struggle against forces both outside and within. The character of the woman who would navigate this treacherous landscape was forged in the crucible of a childhood defined by trauma, loss, and the ever-present stench of political violence. She was born in Florence in 1519, a daughter of the legendary House of Medici. But this was not the name of ancient royal conquerors. It was the name of bankers, of merchants who had clawed their way to the pinnacle of power through cunning, patronage, and immense wealth. To the ancient aristocracies of Europe, like the Valois of France, the Medici were upstarts, shopkeepers, a perception that would follow Catherine like a shadow her entire life, fueling a deep-seated insecurity and a relentless drive to legitimize her family line. Her ancestral curse was not one of poverty, but of perceived illegitimacy. She was an orphan almost from birth. Her mother died within days, her father within a month. She became a pawn in the brutal politics of Italy, a prize to be controlled. The defining event of her youth came during the siege of Florence when, at the age of 8, She was taken from her convent and held hostage by the city's Republican faction, who threatened to hang her from the city walls to deter the besieging papal and imperial armies. For 3 years, the child Catherine lived with this daily threat of a horrific public death. It was in that convent, surrounded by enemies, that the future Queen of France was truly born. She learned that piety could be a shield, that silence was a weapon, and that survival depended not on noble ideals, but on a cold, precise calculation of the shifting loyalties of those who held your life in their hands. This experience did not break her. It forged her into tempered steel. It instilled in her a profound skepticism of absolutes, a deep understanding of human frailty and ambition, and an unshakable belief that the world was a dangerous, unpredictable place where only the most adaptable, the most patient, and the most ruthless could hope to survive. She emerged from this ordeal not with hatred, but with a chilling pragmatism and an almost supernatural ability to mask her true intentions behind a placid, inscrutable exterior. This was the education of the Black Queen. Her first step into the great game of European politics was not a triumphant entrance, but a quiet, humiliating lesson in the brutal realities of a royal court. In 1533, at the age of 14, she was shipped to France, a richly dowered pawn in a dynastic alliance brokered by her uncle, Pope Clement VII. She was married not to the heir, the Dauphin Francis, but to the second son, Henri, the Duke of Orleans, a sullen, athletic youth who was already deeply in love with another woman. That woman was Diane de Poitiers, a beautiful, intelligent aristocrat almost 20 years Henri's senior, who would become the true queen of his heart and his court for the next quarter of a century. For the young Catherine, her arrival in France was a public disgrace. She was the Italian outsider, the merchant's daughter with a questionable pedigree, looked down upon by the French nobility. She was plain, with the characteristic Medici bulging eyes, and she was, most damningly of all, barren. For 10 agonizing years, Catherine failed to produce an heir. In a world where a queen's primary, almost sole function was dynastic propagation, this was a death sentence. The court whispered of repudiation, of being sent back to Italy in shame. She lived in constant fear, a political irrelevance forced to watch as her husband publicly adored his mistress, who held more power and influence than the queen herself. This decade in the shadows was her second great education. She learned to swallow her pride, to befriend her rival, to dissimulate, to wait, and to watch. She became a master of the court's intricate dance of favor and influence, never revealing her ambition, never showing her pain. She turned to unorthodox methods, consulting doctors, astrologers, and magicians in her desperate quest for a child. When at last, she finally conceived and gave birth to the first of her 10 children, it was not just a personal joy, but a political victory of the highest order. She had survived. She had proven her worth in the only currency that truly mattered. The years of humiliation had taught her the supreme value of patience and the absolute necessity of securing her position not through love or loyalty, which were fleeting, but through the one thing no one could take from her: her children, the future kings of France. Behind the placid mask of the dutiful wife and mother, a secret, all-consuming motivation was hardening into an iron resolve. This inner demon was not a simple lust for personal power, but something far more complex and primal: a cult of dynasty. For Catherine, the House of Valois was not just a royal family. It was the vessel of her own legitimacy, the justification for her existence, and the sole purpose of her life. Having been an orphan, a hostage, and a near-barren wife threatened with repudiation, she fixated on her children with a ferocious, almost pathological intensity. They were her creations, her shield against the contempt of the French court, and her pawns in the great game of European survival. Her entire political worldview was filtered through this intensely personal, maternal lens. The good of France was inseparable from the good of the Valois. Any threat to her children's authority, from the overweening ambition of the great nobles, from the revolutionary sermons of Calvinist preachers, from the machinations of Spain or England, was not merely a political problem. It was an existential threat to her very being. This obsession explains the central contradiction of her career. Her willingness to shift alliances, to negotiate with heretics, to employ deception, and ultimately, to sanction violence. She was not ideologically committed to Catholicism in the way Philip II of Spain was. She was ideologically committed to the Valois dynasty. If that meant protecting Huguenots to balance the power of the ultra-Catholic Guise family, she would do it. If it meant slaughtering those same Huguenots to prevent them from dominating her son, the king, she would do that too. This was not cynicism. In her mind, it was the highest form of political morality. The survival of her line, and through it, the French state, was the supreme good that justified any means, however terrible. This deeply personal, almost tribal motivation is the key to understanding her entire career. She was playing for the highest stakes imaginable, not just for a kingdom, but for the immortality of her own bloodline, to prove that the merchant's daughter from Florence could found a dynasty to rival any in Europe. Into this world of simmering tension and dynastic anxiety stepped the two great forces that would act as the tectonic plates of the coming conflict, grinding against each other with Catherine's court as the epicenter. These were the great aristocratic power blocks whose rivalry would soon escalate into open warfare, tearing the kingdom apart. On one side stood the House of Guise, led by the formidable Duke François, a celebrated war hero, and his brother, the cunning and manipulative Cardinal of Lorraine. The Guises were the champions of an uncompromising, militant Catholicism. They were handsome, charismatic, immensely popular with the fanatical Catholic mobs of Paris, and dangerously ambitious. They saw the rise of Protestantism not just as a heresy to be crushed, but as an opportunity to elevate their own house, perhaps even to the throne itself, by positioning themselves as the saviors of the true faith. On the other side were the princes of the blood, the Bourbons, most notably Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, and his fiery younger brother Louis, Prince of Condé. As direct descendants of Saint Louis, they had a legitimate, if distant, claim to the French throne. They became the political leaders and military protectors of the burgeoning Huguenot movement. For them, Calvinism was both a sincere faith and a powerful political tool, a way to rally a state within a state against the centralized power of the crown and the immense influence of their Guise rivals. Catherine de Medici found herself trapped directly between these two gathering storms. To her, they were two equal and opposite threats. The Guises, with their Catholic fanaticism, sought to control the crown and pursue a reckless policy of persecution that would surely lead to civil war. The Bourbons and their Huguenot allies, with their revolutionary ideology and powerful private armies, threatened to undermine the very principle of monarchy and dismember the kingdom. Her entire political career, from the moment she stepped into power, would be a desperate high-wire balancing act, a constant effort to play one faction against the other, to weaken both, and to ensure that neither could ever dominate the throne of her sons. It was a game she was uniquely suited to play, but a game whose rules were about to be rewritten in blood. The game began far sooner than she could have imagined, and her entry into it was marked by the scent of blood and myrrh. On a hot summer day in 1559, during a tournament celebrating a peace treaty, her husband, King Henri II, took a lance to the face. A splinter of wood pierced his eye and penetrated his brain. For 10 agonizing days, as the king lay dying, the court held its breath. The moment Henri died, the world shifted on its axis. Catherine, for 26 years, the overshadowed queen, was suddenly the mother of the new king, the frail 15-year-old Francis II. But any hope she had of guiding her son was immediately dashed. The new king was completely under the thumb of his young wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, a niece of the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine. Instantly, the Guise faction seized control of the government. Catherine, though now the Queen Mother, was sidelined once again, forced to watch as the Guise brothers implemented a brutal policy of religious persecution, setting up special courts that sent hundreds of Huguenots to the stake. She was powerless, but she was learning. She saw how swiftly power could shift, how ruthlessly it was wielded, and how the machinery of the state could be turned to serve the ambitions of a single family. This was the price of power, she realized. It was absolute, immediate, and belonged only to those who were bold enough to seize it. She held her counsel, maintained her quiet dignity, and waited. Her wait was not long. After a reign of just 17 months, the sickly Francis II died. The throne passed to her second son, Charles IX, a boy of 10. This time, there would be no mistake. A 10-year-old could not rule. A regent was required. Catherine, outmaneuvering all her rivals, stepped out of the shadows and seized the regency of France for herself. At the age of 41, after decades of humiliation and waiting, the shopkeeper's daughter was, in all but name, the ruler of the kingdom. She had finally paid the price of admission and taken her seat at the table of the great game. The central, overwhelming threat Catherine faced as regent was not the Habsburgs on her borders, but the enemy within. This was the organized, militarized, and rapidly growing movement of French Calvinists, known as the Huguenots. To understand the wars of religion, one must understand that this was never merely a theological dispute. Calvinism, as it took root in France, became a potent political and military force, a direct challenge to the fundamental structure of the Valois monarchy. It attracted not just sincere converts, but also a huge swathe of the nobility, from lesser gentry resentful of their declining status, to great princes of the blood like Condé and the powerful Châtillon brothers, Odet, the cardinal, and Gaspard de Coligny, the admiral of France. These men did not just build churches, they built a parallel state. They held their own synods, collected their own taxes, and most critically, raised their own armies. In the towns and regions where they held sway, particularly in the south of France, they created a disciplined, self-governing republic in waiting that rendered the king's authority null and void. For Catherine, whose entire political being was oriented around the preservation of a strong, centralized monarchy under her sons, this state within a state was an intolerable cancer. It was a direct assault on the sacred principle of one king, one law, one faith that had held France together for centuries. Her enemy was not a doctrine. It was a revolution cloaked in the language of theology. The Huguenots' leader, the Admiral Coligny, was a man of immense ability and integrity, a figure who embodied the threat. He was a brilliant soldier and a charismatic leader who could inspire fanatic loyalty. In him, Catherine saw the ultimate antagonist, a subject more powerful than the king, a man whose personal authority rivaled that of the crown itself. All her policies for the next decade would be aimed at solving this one intractable problem: how to neutralize the Huguenot political and military machine without tearing the kingdom itself to pieces in the process. Catherine's initial strategy for dealing with the Huguenot threat was one of calculated moderation, an attempt to find a political solution to a religious problem. But she quickly received a brutal lesson in the futility of such a course in an age of rising fanaticism. In March of 1560, a group of Huguenot noblemen, encouraged by the Prince of Condé, hatched a plot. Known as the Conspiracy of Amboise, their plan was to storm the royal castle, seize the young King Francis II, arrest the Guise brothers, and force a new policy of religious toleration. It was a direct assault on the crown, thinly disguised as a liberation of the king from evil advisers. The plot was discovered, and the Guise response was swift and merciless. They hunted down the conspirators and made a terrifying public example of them. Day after day, the courtyard of the magnificent Château d'Amboise was turned into an execution ground. Dozens of men were hanged from the battlements, their bodies left dangling from the castle's iron balcony as a grim warning. Catherine and the entire court, including the young king and his wife Mary, were forced to watch the executions. It was a spectacle of calculated terror, designed by the Guise to demonstrate their power and the fate of those who dared to challenge them. For Catherine, it was a horrifying and formative experience. She saw firsthand the depths of the hatred that was tearing at the fabric of her kingdom, and she learned a fatal lesson. In this new, brutal world, any attempt at compromise or moderation would be interpreted by her enemies not as wisdom, but as weakness. The conspiracy of Amboise failed in its immediate goal, but it succeeded in poisoning the political atmosphere beyond repair. It shattered any remaining trust between the factions, raised the stakes of the conflict to life and death, and set France on an inexorable path toward the first of its 8 devastating civil wars. Catherine, the would-be peacemaker, was now presiding over a kingdom primed for slaughter. When her first son died, and she assumed the full regency for the young Charles IX, Catherine made her most audacious move yet: a grand gamble to seize opportunity from the chaos. With the Guise temporarily weakened by the loss of their royal niece's influence, Catherine asserted her own authority and pivoted dramatically. She, a Catholic queen, began a policy of official, if limited, religious toleration. This culminated in the famous colloquy of Poissy in 1561. It was an extraordinary event, a grand theological summit orchestrated by Catherine herself. She brought together the leading Catholic bishops and cardinals of France to debate face-to-face with the most prominent Calvinist theologians, led by the charismatic Theodore Beza. Her hope, born of a Renaissance humanist's faith in reason and dialogue, was that these brilliant men could find some common ground, some compromise on doctrine that could allow for peaceful coexistence. It was a magnificent and magnificently naive gesture. The colloquy was a spectacular failure. The theological chasm was simply too wide to be bridged by words. The talks collapsed in mutual recrimination, with both sides more convinced than ever of the other's damnation. Her enemies were aghast. To the ultra-Catholics and the Pope, her trafficking with heretics was a scandal. To Philip of Spain, it was proof of her unreliability. To the Calvinists, it was a trick. Yet, in its failure, the colloquy was a political masterstroke for Catherine. It established her, in the eyes of the world and the French people, as the one figure standing above the fray, the only person willing to put the peace of the kingdom before the dogmatic purity of any one faction. She used the chaos of religious division to carve out a space for the crown, positioning her son not as the leader of the Catholics, but as the arbiter of all the French. She had failed to make peace, but she had succeeded in seizing the political center and, with it, absolute control of the government. It was a dangerous place to be, but for now, it made her indispensable. For a brief, brilliant period, Catherine's strategy seemed to work. This was the apex of her power as a stateswoman, the moment of her greatest triumph as the regent of a fragile kingdom. Having established her authority, she embarked on a remarkable project to restore the prestige and power of the Valois monarchy. The centerpiece of this was the Grand Tour of France, which lasted from 1564 to 1566. For nearly 2 years, she led the young King Charles IX and the entire court on a colossal procession through the most rebellious and divided provinces of the kingdom. It was a masterful piece of political theater, a massive public relations campaign on a medieval scale. Part military parade, part royal pageant. The tour was designed to show the face of the king to his people, to awe recalcitrant nobles with the splendor of the court, to enforce royal edicts, and to remind every corner of France that they had a master. Alongside this projection of power, Catherine engaged in a dizzying ballet of diplomacy. She skillfully played the great powers off against each other, dangling the prospect of a royal marriage for one of her children before the courts of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and England, using her offspring as her most valuable diplomatic assets to keep her potential enemies off balance and to prevent the formation of any hostile coalition against France. She was, in these years, the consummate Medici banker, meticulously balancing the complex accounts of European power politics. She held the fractured, violent, and nearly ungovernable kingdom of France together by the sheer force of her personality, her tireless work ethic, and her unparalleled genius for political maneuvering. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the Florentine shopkeeper's daughter had achieved the impossible. She had imposed her will on a kingdom hell-bent on its own destruction. But as Catherine reached the summit of her influence, the shadows of her legend began to lengthen. It was precisely during this period of her greatest success as a peacemaker and stateswoman that the enduring, monstrous image of the Black Queen was born and solidified. Her very strengths were reforged into the instruments of her damnation in the court of public opinion. Her Italian heritage, a source of cultural pride, was twisted by xenophobic French pamphleteers into the sinister mark of the foreigner, the inheritor of the dark arts of poison and assassination for which Renaissance Italy was infamous. Her pragmatism, her willingness to negotiate with heretics and shift alliances for the good of the state, was seen not as political genius, but as godless, Machiavellian duplicity. Her deep interest in science and astrology, a common pursuit for a Renaissance ruler, was depicted as a reliance on black magic and demonic prophecy. She surrounded herself with a coterie of Italian advisors, financiers, and astrologers like the notorious Cosimo Ruggieri, feeding the perception that she was ruling France through a foreign cabal of sorcerers. She was a woman in a world of absolute masculine power, a ruler who could not lead armies into battle. So she used the tools available to her: intelligence, patronage, espionage, and intrigue. She created a formidable network of spies and informants, her famous flying squadron of beautiful court ladies who were tasked with extracting the secrets of powerful men. To her enemies, this was not statecraft. It was proof of her corrupt, manipulative, and fundamentally feminine nature. She saw herself as the physician to a sick and fevered France, applying whatever remedy was necessary to keep the patient alive. But to the patient itself, she was beginning to look like the source of the disease, a cold, calculating spider at the center of a web of intrigue, the evil queen of a dark fairy tale. This black legend would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, a mask that would eventually merge with the face of the woman beneath it. At the heart of the ideological struggle was a deeply personal rivalry, a clash of two formidable women who represented the two irreconcilable faces of France. If Catherine was the embodiment of pragmatic political Catholicism, her sworn enemy was Jeanne d'Albret, the Queen of Navarre, the unyielding soul of the Huguenot cause. Jeanne was everything Catherine was not. She was a true believer, a woman of fiery, absolute faith who had declared Calvinism the official religion of her kingdom of Navarre and Béarn. Where Catherine was a master of ambiguity and compromise, Jeanne was a figure of stark, unwavering conviction. She was a queen in her own right, a brilliant political operator and a stern, almost fanatical moralist who despised the decadence and perceived godlessness of Catherine's court. Their rivalry was far more than political. It was a battle of mothers, each fighting for the future of their children and their vision of France. Jeanne's son was the young Henry of Navarre, the great hope of the Protestant cause and the next in line to the French throne after Catherine's own sons. The personal drama between these two queens was a microcosm of the entire French conflict. They corresponded, they negotiated, they met in tense, face-to-face encounters where Catherine's silky diplomacy crashed against Jeanne's iron-willed piety. Jeanne saw Catherine as a vacillating, untrustworthy Jezebel who would sacrifice any principle for the sake of power. Catherine, in turn, saw Jeanne as a dangerous, rigid fanatic whose refusal to compromise threatened to plunge the entire kingdom into an apocalyptic war. Their struggle would reach its climax in the arrangement of the marriage between Catherine's daughter, Marguerite, and Jeanne's son, Henry, a union that Catherine hoped would finally bring peace, but one which Jeanne rightly feared was a gilded trap. She died of natural causes shortly before the wedding, but her Huguenot followers would later accuse Catherine of having her poisoned with a pair of scented gloves, a baseless but powerful accusation that perfectly encapsulated the Black Queen legend. Even as she wrestled with the hydra of religious civil war, Catherine never ceased to be a true daughter of Florence, a Medici who understood that power must not only be held, but it must also be displayed. She wielded art, architecture, and spectacle as essential tools of statecraft, seeking to impose order and awe on a violently chaotic world. While the nobles of France were plotting civil war, Catherine was pouring the vast resources of the crown into cultural projects on an unprecedented scale. She began the construction of the magnificent Tuileries Palace, a masterpiece of Renaissance design that was intended to be a monument to the enduring glory of the Valois dynasty. She commissioned priceless tapestries, exquisite portraits by François Clouet, and amassed a legendary collection of art and books. But her most potent cultural weapons were her court festivals, known as magnificences. These were not mere parties. They were breathtakingly elaborate allegorical spectacles, often lasting for days, that combined theater, music, dance, and mock battles. They were exercises in political propaganda, designed to project an image of royal power, harmony, and wealth, even when the kingdom was on the verge of bankruptcy and civil war. She would stage these events at crucial political moments, bringing the feuding Catholic and Huguenot nobles together in a carefully orchestrated fantasy world of chivalry and classical mythology. The message was clear. Allegiance to the Valois crown offered a life of pleasure and splendor, while rebellion offered only chaos and death. For a time, she attempted to sublimate the violent energies of her aristocracy, replacing the deadly reality of the tournament, which had killed her husband, with the theatrical fantasy of the court ballet, which she introduced to France. This was power through illusion, the attempt of a supremely intelligent and cultured ruler to civilize a savage age, but it was a mask of civility laid over a reality of blood, a beautiful dream from which France was about to have a very rude awakening. The fatal flaw in Catherine's grand design, the ultimate source of her tragedy, lay with the very children for whose sake she fought so tirelessly. Her serpent brood, as they were later called, were not the strong, stable pillars of a new dynasty she had prayed for, but a collection of damaged, unreliable, and ultimately doomed figures. Francis II was a sickly boy who died before he could leave a mark. The next son, King Charles IX, was more promising but was neurotic, emotionally unstable, and psychologically scarred by the violence he witnessed as a child. He was prone to fits of rage and was dangerously susceptible to the influence of stronger personalities, a weakness Catherine was constantly forced to manage. Her third son, Henri, the Duke of Anjou and her unabashed favorite, was intelligent and capable but also effeminate, deeply decadent, and drawn to a circle of glamorous, dangerous young men known as the mignons. Her youngest son, François, the Duke of Alençon, was physically deformed, pathologically ambitious, and a perpetual traitor who would repeatedly betray his own family by siding with the Huguenot rebels in pursuit of his own advancement. And then there was her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, famous for her beauty and intelligence, but also notoriously promiscuous, whose personal life would become a scandal that further tarnished the family's reputation. Catherine's love for them was undeniable, but it was a suffocating, manipulative love. She used them as chess pieces, arranging their marriages for political advantage, dictating their policies, and playing them off against one another to maintain her own central role. She had fought to give them a kingdom, but she had raised a generation of rulers who were psychologically and politically incapable of holding it together. The weakness and dysfunction of her own children would prove to be the single greatest threat to the Valois dynasty she had sacrificed everything to protect. The first cracks in Catherine's carefully constructed edifice of peace began to appear not from her enemies, but from within her own family, from the heart of her own son. As King Charles IX grew into manhood, he began to yearn for his own authority and to resent his mother's constant, suffocating control. He found the father figure and mentor he craved in the one man Catherine could not afford to have near the throne, the Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The great Huguenot leader, a man of immense charisma and military prestige, was readmitted to the royal council as part of a peace settlement. He quickly developed a powerful, almost hypnotic influence over the young king. Coligny presented Charles with a grand, intoxicating vision: to end the civil wars by uniting Catholic and Protestant Frenchmen in a common cause, a great patriotic war against France's traditional enemy, Catholic Spain. He urged the king to intervene in the Netherlands, to support the Protestant Dutch rebels against the brutal rule of Philip II. For Charles, this was a chance to prove himself a great warrior king, to step out of his mother's shadow and forge his own glorious legacy. For Catherine, it was a nightmare. Coligny's plan threatened to shatter her entire foreign policy, which was based on maintaining a fragile peace with the Spanish superpower. A war with Spain was a war France could not win. It would mean financial ruin, military disaster, and the end of the Valois dynasty. She pleaded, she argued, she threatened, but she found her influence over her son waning for the first time in his life. The king was being seduced by the admiral. For Catherine, the situation was becoming intolerable. Coligny was no longer just the leader of a rival faction. He was a personal threat, a rival for the heart and mind of the king, and the one man whose ambition was about to undo her 30 years of work. Faced with the imminent catastrophe of a war with Spain and the loss of control over her own son, Catherine fell back on the dark arts of Medici politics. She made her final, fateful gamble. To seal the latest peace treaty and create a foundation for national unity, she had orchestrated the marriage of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to the young Protestant leader, Henry of Navarre. The wedding, in August 1572, was meant to be her masterpiece of reconciliation, a symbol of a new era of peace. It brought the entire Huguenot nobility, hundreds of their leaders, knights, and retainers, into the fiercely Catholic city of Paris. The city seethed with resentment, its fanatical population viewing the presence of the heretics and the scandalous marriage as a profound offense to God. The atmosphere was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came on August 22nd, as Admiral Coligny was walking back to his lodgings from the Louvre. A shot rang out from an upstairs window. An assassin's arquebus blast tore off one of his fingers and shattered his left elbow. The admiral survived, but the assassination attempt, a shocking breach of the royal peace, blew the fragile reconciliation to pieces. The Huguenots were enraged, convinced the attempt had been orchestrated by the Guise family, and perhaps by the Queen Mother herself. They stormed into the Louvre, demanding justice from the king, issuing dark threats of a terrible vengeance if the culprits were not found. Catherine's gamble had backfired spectacularly. The failed assassination, likely arranged by the Guise with her tacit approval, or at the very least her connivance, had not eliminated the threat. Instead, it had created an explosive, terrifying crisis. She was trapped in a city filled with two armed and furious factions, with her son the king panicking, and with the Huguenots, who had come to Paris under her personal guarantee of safety, now baying for blood. The wedding of peace was about to become the prelude to a massacre. This was the moment of greatest catastrophe, the moral point of no return for Catherine and for France. In the 2 days following the failed assassination of Coligny, the Louvre Palace became a pressure cooker of panic and paranoia. The Huguenot leaders were armed and furious, threatening a new civil war. The Catholic faction, led by the Guise, warned that the Protestants were plotting a coup to seize the king and slaughter their enemies. King Charles IX, weak and indecisive, vacillated wildly, first promising justice to the wounded Coligny, then succumbing to fear as reports of Huguenot plots flooded the palace. It was in this atmosphere of extreme crisis that a small group, including Catherine, her favorite son Henri of Anjou, and other members of the royal council, made a fateful decision. The exact details are lost to the conflicting accounts of history, but the outcome is clear. They convinced the hysterical king that a Huguenot uprising was imminent, and that the only way to save the crown and the kingdom was a swift, surgical, preemptive strike. They would execute Admiral Coligny and a targeted list of 2 or 3 dozen of the main Huguenot leaders. It was to be a swift, controlled act of state violence, a decapitation of the Huguenot military command. But the decision, born of desperation and fear in the claustrophobic confines of the palace, metastasized into a monster the moment it touched the superheated atmosphere of Paris. When the bells of Saint-Germain began to ring in the pre-dawn hours of August 24th, It was the signal not just for the royal guards, but for the Catholic mobs of the city, whipped into a frenzy by years of fanatical preaching. The controlled execution spiraled instantly into a citywide orgy of sectarian slaughter. For 3 days, the streets of Paris ran with blood as thousands of Huguenots, men, women, and children, were dragged from their beds and butchered. The violence then spread like a virus to the provinces, where tens of thousands more were killed over the next several weeks. Catherine had sought to eliminate a few dozen political rivals. She had unleashed a demon that would consume a generation. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was a political and psychological collapse. Catherine had won the battle, but lost the war for the soul of her kingdom. Her son, King Charles IX, who had either ordered or at the very least hysterically approved the slaughter, was left a broken man. He was haunted by what he had done, plagued by nightmares and visions of his screaming victims. His already fragile health, both mental and physical, disintegrated completely. He would live for less than 2 years after the massacre, his reign dissolving into a paranoid, blood-soaked haze. Far from ending the Huguenot threat, the massacre had transformed it. The political movement became a revolutionary one. Protestant theorists now openly argued for the right to resist and overthrow a tyrannical king, creating an ideological justification for permanent civil war. The Fourth War of Religion erupted with a fury and bitterness that made the previous conflicts seem like skirmishes. The Huguenots, fighting with the desperation of a people marked for extermination, became more resilient and more determined than ever. Catherine's dream of a strong, united France under the authority of her son was dead, drowned in the blood of St. Bartholomew's Day. She had hoped to cut the head off the serpent of rebellion, but instead she had created a hydra. The monarchy was morally bankrupt, the king was a madman, and the kingdom was fractured beyond any hope of repair. The ultimate irony was that in her desperate attempt to secure the Valois dynasty, she had dealt it a mortal blow, staining it with an infamy from which it would never recover. The Black Queen now reigned over a kingdom of ghosts. The final act of Catherine's long and bloody saga was a slow, agonizing descent into irrelevance, a drawn-out epilogue played against the backdrop of a kingdom in its death throes. She lived for another 17 years after the massacre, long enough to see her haunted son Charles die and to place her favorite Henri III on the throne. But the furies she had unleashed were now beyond anyone's control. The wars of religion continued, mutating into a three-way struggle between the Huguenots, led by Henry of Navarre, the increasingly powerful Catholic League, led by a new generation of the Guise family, and the beleaguered royalists loyal to her son. She continued to scheme, to negotiate, to advise, but her power was a pale shadow of what it had been. In the end, she was outmaneuvered by the very forces of extremism she had tried to balance. She died in her bed on January 5th, 1589, at the age of 69, in the Château de Blois. Her death was almost an afterthought. Paris was controlled by the Catholic League, her son the king was a fugitive, and the kingdom was in a state of near-total anarchy. Legend claims that her confessor told her she would die near Saint-Germain, and so she had always avoided the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, whose bells had signaled the massacre. She died in apartments at Blois that were under the parish of Saint-Germain. Her final piece of advice to her son Henri, a counsel born of a lifetime of bitter experience, was a staggering irony. She urged him to make peace with his Protestant cousin, Henri of Navarre, the man who had survived the massacre she orchestrated. It was a final, desperate act of pragmatism, a recognition that the Valois dynasty was doomed and that only her old enemy could now save the French state. Just months later, her son Henri III was assassinated, and the House of Valois, for which she had sacrificed everything, became extinct. The legacy of Catherine de Medici is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a historical Rorschach test onto which successive generations have projected their own fears and prejudices. There is no single, agreed-upon verdict, only a series of warring portraits. For Protestant historians, and for centuries of popular imagination, she is the ultimate villain, the monstrous Machiavellian Black Queen, the Italian Jezebel who orchestrated the cold-blooded murder of thousands of innocents. In this narrative, she is a master of poison, a student of the occult, a creature of pure, calculating evil. For her ultra-Catholic contemporaries and their historical defenders, she was almost the opposite. A weak, indecisive, and dangerously pragmatic ruler whose constant attempts to compromise with heretics were the true cause of France's woes. In their view, the massacre was not a crime, but a necessary, if tragically bungled, act of state, a holy duty she had shirked for far too long. For French nationalists of a later era, she was the perennial outsider, the foreigner whose Italian methods and reliance on foreign advisors polluted the French body politic and weakened the kingdom. And finally, there is the modern revisionist view, which sees her as a tragic, brilliant, and largely misunderstood figure of Renaissance statecraft. In this interpretation, she was a political genius, a courageous survivor who, against impossible odds, held a disintegrating kingdom together for 30 years. She was a pragmatist in an age of fanatics, a stateswoman whose primary goal was not religious purity, but the preservation of the French state and the authority of the crown. In this light, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not the culmination of a sinister master plan, but a catastrophic, panicked miscalculation, the tragic failure of a lifetime dedicated to finding a middle way. So, how did the mother drown her kingdom in blood? The final, comprehensive answer to this central paradox lies not in a single motive, but in the fatal collision between her character and her circumstances. Catherine de Medici was, first and foremost, a dynastic absolutist. Her fierce, obsessive, and almost pathological maternal drive to protect the power and legacy of her children was the fixed star of her universe. She was not French. She was Valois. The good of the state was utterly synonymous with the survival of her bloodline. This Medici-bred pragmatism, forged in the crucible of Florentine politics, saw the state as a secular creation to be managed, not a divine one to be purified. When this intensely personal, dynastic obsession was placed into the cauldron of 16th-century France, a kingdom being torn apart by the new and absolute ideology of religious truth, the result was explosive. She applied the tools of a political realist to a problem that had become metaphysical. She tried to negotiate with men who believed they were doing God's work, to compromise with factions who saw compromise as a mortal sin. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was the final, horrifying proof that her methods had failed. It was not an act of strength, but one of ultimate weakness and desperation. Faced with the loss of control over her son and the prospect of a disastrous war, her nerve broke. She fell back on the brutal, cynical logic of the Italian vendetta, a swift, surgical strike to eliminate the leadership of a rival family. But France was not Florence. Her panicked gambit, her last throw of the dice, unleashed forces of popular fanaticism that she could not comprehend and could never control. She drowned France in blood because her love for her children was greater than her love for her people. and because she fundamentally misunderstood the terrifying, apocalyptic power of an idea whose time had come. The ultimate universal lesson of Catherine de Medici's life is a chilling testament to the agony of the political center in an age of violent, irreconcilable extremes. She was a creature of the Renaissance, a believer in reason, negotiation, and the art of the possible. Yet she was fated to rule during the Reformation, an era dominated by the terrifying certainty of faith and the politics of damnation. Her entire career was a desperate attempt to find a third way, a path of moderation between two ideological poles that were pulling her world apart. To the ultra-Catholics, her willingness to tolerate Protestants was heresy. To the Protestants, her Catholic faith and her political machinations were proof of tyranny. In a world that demanded absolute loyalty to one side or the other, her pragmatism was seen by all as the most profound treachery. She stands as a timeless warning of what happens when the fabric of society becomes so polarized that the very act of seeking compromise is viewed as a crime. Her tragedy was that she was a political animal in an age that had become theological. She sought to manage human ambition while those around her were fighting for the immortal soul. The result was that she was consumed by the very fires she sought to quench, hated and mistrusted by all sides, her name becoming a permanent synonym for the duplicity that fanatics always ascribe to those who refuse to join their cause. The verdict of history on Catherine is that she tried to navigate an apocalyptic storm in a politician's rowboat, and in the end, the storm overwhelmed her, her family, and the kingdom she had fought so desperately to save. The final frame is not of the Queen herself, shrouded in black and whispering plots in the corridors of the Louvre. It is a quieter, more desolate image. It is the throne room of France, years after her death. The tapestries are the same, the stone is just as cold, but the throne itself, the great seat of the Valois kings for which she had lied, schemed, married off her children, and sanctioned a massacre, is empty. Her line is extinct. Her sons are all dead, without legitimate heirs. The dynasty she sacrificed her soul to protect has vanished from the earth. And then, a figure approaches the throne. He is a warrior, battle-hardened and charismatic, a man who wears his crown with an easy confidence. It is Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot boy who survived the massacre, the son of her great rival, Jean d'Albret. He is now Henri IV, King of France, having converted to Catholicism with the famously pragmatic line, "Paris is worth a mass." He has brought peace to the kingdom, not through extermination, but through the Edict of Nantes, an act of toleration that was the very policy Catherine had once championed and failed to implement. The supreme irony of her life is this: her ultimate failure was the seed of her ultimate success. Her dynasty was gone, but the French state, the French monarchy, had survived. It was saved by the man she had tried to kill, who was now practicing the very art of political compromise she had taught him through 30 years of bloody, relentless war. The shadow of the Black Queen is long, and in it, we see the terrifying, paradoxical truth that sometimes the only path to peace is through an abyss of fire.